Welcome everyone to the third edition of Global Civics. Thanks for coming. We're in our third of 6 episodes. And as usual, we're going to start with a brief PowerPoint presentation. And that'll be followed by a short break. Then our discussants will come to these little tables and talk about the issue of legitimacy, which we'll get into shortly. Just a reminder to be mindful of using the microphones when you're speaking. This is kind of a live-to-tape. It is a live-to-tape television program. It'll be telecast across Montana in November and December in a serial form. So we have to be paying attention to capturing good sound. After the discussants discuss, of course, it's time for public comment. We invite public comment. There's no pressure to participate in this way, but you're always more than welcome to enter the conversation that we're having about this topic. And then lastly, before the evening's over, which that'll be 8:30, we'll have a quiz, and it's a participatory quiz. It's not meant to put anybody on the spot, but to learn something that you might not know already. So I want to first go back just for a moment to where we've come from. You know, we're approaching this subject from the Montana perspective. We're kind of gazing through a lens that's familiar to us. We want to analyze global civics in a multidimensional way. We started with the theme of globalization. Last week we advanced to the subject of sovereignty, and tonight we're going to be dwelling on a second component of this triad of analysis called legitimacy. So I wanted to start tonight by just looking back briefly. You know, Africa is on a lot of our minds. It's hard to avoid not thinking about Africa now with the Ebola scare. We're witnessing a stunning display of how interdependence and globalized transportation systems have resulted in new vulnerabilities to pandemics. This slide is about a different kind, there's a scramble from Africa and about Africa going on now, but I want to take you back in time to what's probably an obscure event for anybody who's not a historian, and that is a conference in 1884 and 85. At the request of Portugal, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called together the major Western powers to negotiate questions and end confusion over the control of Africa. At the time, 80% of Africa remained under traditional and local control. What ultimately resulted was a hodgepodge of geometric boundaries that divided the continent into 50 irregular countries. This new map was superimposed over the 1,000 indigenous cultures and religions of Africa. The new countries lacked rhyme or reason and divided coherent groups of people and merged together disparate groups who really did not get along. Just for the record, France, Great Britain, Portugal, and Germany were the major players. The English philosopher John Locke, the papal coat of arms, a coterie of Chinese warlords, each represents different types of legitimacy. Locke, the empire of reason; the papacy, the enduring authority of the vicar of Christ; and the Chinese have what they recall as the mandate of a godless heaven. Max Weber is perhaps the foremost sociologist of modern times. He articulated 3 basic types of political legitimacy, each of which has the support of many millions of people even today. We're looking at the British Crown, the North Korean basketball fan who also has no nuclear weapons, and inside the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. The yin and yang of legitimacy are internal domestic acquiescence or even enthusiastic acceptance of a regime, juxtaposed and intertwined with other countries granting diplomatic recognition. Notice today how the news media is careful to say the so-called Islamic State. It's of questionable legitimacy. It lacks internal cohesion, at least from our perspective, and nobody has recognized it as yet as a state. Most Americans and Europeans equate legitimacy with democracy. That seems natural and fair-minded to people like us. We're accustomed to thinking of our governments at each level as accountable and uncorrupted, even if increasingly untrustworthy. And as an aside, I would assert that trust in government is a hallmark of legitimacy. However, as global citizens, it's incumbent on each of us to consider the inadequacies of our democracy and the contradictions that arise and quickly multiply when a legitimate government behaves badly outside of its jurisdictional boundaries. Thomas Jefferson is lionized by nearly everyone in the U.S., that is, every group. Democrats, Republicans, Independents, Libertarians, and the Tea Party, too. He's a hero abroad as well. Jefferson, who's quoted in the top end of the slide, acknowledged the healthful effects of an aroused body politic. Interestingly, there are 37 countries with constitutional provisions allowing or even obligating citizens to rebel against a constitutionally established government. This harkens back to popular sovereignty as an overarching principle, something we addressed last week. The U.S. Constitution does not contain an explicit proviso, unlike the more recently crafted basic laws of Germany, Honduras, and Ghana, and there are others, of course. Fidel Castro cited a specific section of the Cuban Constitution when he started the uprising against Batista. Several state constitutions invoked the legitimacy of insurrection, including Texas, New Hampshire, and Montana. You might recall last week we looked at Article 2, Section 2 on self-government, wherein the people, quote, may alter or abolish the Constitution and form of government whenever they deem it necessary. As an aside, with no particular point in mind, Great Britain is one of the few countries, democratic countries in the world, that has no written constitution. Elections are another bellwether of legitimacy, especially in nominally democratic states. And there are a lot of nominal democratic states in the world. There's barely a country in the world that would not claim to be democratic. Syrian elections happened earlier this year. Assad won another 7-year term with an 88.7% majority and a 74% turnout. In the eyes of his supporters, that's legitimacy. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood won a majority before a military coup. The current leader, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, won 97% of the vote with a 47% turnout of eligible voters. You'll probably hear from our discussants later this evening about recent elections in Ukraine. And another situation where democracy was at work was in Gaza, that part of Palestine that's attached loosely to the Mediterranean Sea. You know where Gaza is. When they were afforded an election, they elected Hamas, an Islamic extremist organization. At least that's how it's viewed in the United States. So there's a bit of a problem from our perspective on the spread of democracy in areas where it's not culturally embedded. It's not a natural, or seemingly historic, natural form of government. When elections happen in certain places, the outcome is not to our likings, but as simply as I can say. More recently, the Scots voted, and we talked about this last week, 55% to 45% to secede from the United Kingdom. And that narrow victory, it's actually not very narrow, but it was expected to be even narrower than it was. Nevertheless, it elicited promises from the Prime Minister of Great Britain for greater autonomy. That's caused a bit of a constitutional, in lowercase, crisis in the UK, because now England has to figure out how to structure a new set of arrangements between England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Granting more autonomy to Scotland means they have to figure out how to deal with the vast majority of the people in the UK, which are actually in England. The Catalans in Spain, Catalonia is a province or a state within in Spain in the northeast quarter, the richest part of Spain. They were watching the Scottish referendum very closely and were disappointed in the outcome because both Scotland and Catalonia figure they want to be independent, but very much a part of the European Union. They don't want sovereignty just for its own sake. They want to be part of a global engine, the European Union, and have the ability to call their own shots with respect to culture, language, and even foreign policy. They were bracing for a similar vote next month, but have stepped back mainly for fear of a constitutional crisis in the midst of a still weak European economy. So they haven't given up on the idea of independence, but they're not going to call for a referendum vote because it's against the law in Spain, whereas it was within the law in the United Kingdom. In recent elections to the European Parliament, there was a 43% turnout, and it wasn't evenly distributed. For example, only 13% of the voters in Slovakia, a new member of the EU, voted for the European Parliament. The consequence of the election is that a number of populist, nationalist fringe parties now have seats in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, and Greece. And the United Kingdom, for the first time ever, elected a member of a separatist party to the British Parliament. It's worthwhile to remember that one of the appeals of 20th century fascism, that is in Germany and Italy and Spain, was its condemnation of parliamentary government, whereby a mere 51% of the electorate can take charge of the other 49%. So these fringe parties are not just nationalist, they take a dim view of what we regard as normal parliamentary democracy. And it's scary to some people in Europe. Nevertheless, in 21st century Europe, notwithstanding these elections to the European Parliament, which is a very weak organization, we might want to talk about that in greater detail. The European Union is a very complex organism with different institutions making authoritative decisions. The European Parliament, which does elect people from all over the community, is the weakest of these institutions. The strongest still cling to the notion of national sovereignty. So when the European Union starts to falter economically and politically or in terms of foreign policy, the typical response to that among European citizens is to revert to their national identity, to act as French, as Germans, as British. We should think a little bit about our own elections. Our local and state elections don't get a high turnout. Our presidential elections aren't bad. In the last decade, we've had from 50 to 57% of the eligible voters turn out. But it wasn't too long ago, in the year 2000, where the outcome of the presidential election between Bush and Gore is still questionable in terms of legitimacy. It was decided by the Supreme Court. A lot of people, several Supreme Courts, and finally the U.S. Supreme Court. And to this day, I encounter many people who question the legitimacy of that procedure. Did we actually follow our own laws and reach a popular decision? People also question the legitimacy of the Electoral College. That's another issue. Article 38, subsection 1 of the Statute of the International Court of Justice at The Hague provides a short list of legal foundations to the edifice of international law. The ICJ, as it's called, renders decisions on disputes between states that voluntarily submit themselves and their respective cases to the court. In other words, the International Court of Justice does not deal with human rights issues. It does not deal with individuals. It's when a country has a boundary dispute or something of that nature with another country. This is the court organized at the United Nations, located in The Hague in the Netherlands, where judges determine the outcome. These are peaceful decisions. At any rate, I'm bringing international law into this as a foundation for legitimacy in the world of international affairs. I'll tell you right now, this slide is a little problematic for me. I thought about ditching it, but then I brought it back. There's clearly a tension between the legal status of a state and its behavior in the world at large, not to mention within its own borders. So in the international system, states are by definition legitimate. If they're recognized by one another, they are legitimate, irrespective of their behavior toward their own citizens or toward their neighbors. Governments of states are constantly trying to legitimize themselves and their behavior. So that's the noise that we hear daily from our own government, from other governments, is largely about legitimizing decisions that may or may not be popular. There are instances where foreign policy actions are regarded as legitimate, but they're not lawful. A good example of that was the United States intervention in Kosovo. That was technically illegal. It was not sanctioned by the United Nations. It was a violation of sovereignty, Serbia's sovereignty. But most people shrug that away and say, well, it was a good thing. It was the right thing to do, even though it was against the law. On the other side, all kinds of behavior by legitimate actors, states, are intended to delegitimize the opposition. So today, obviously, we can look at Ukraine with Russia's efforts to delegitimize the Ukrainian government, to, no doubt all kinds of thugs and agents in Hong Kong hired by somebody in China, the Chinese foreign, their equivalent of the CIA. We know that this happens all over the place, that governments are always doing their best to undermine the legitimacy of those forces within their society and those countries outside that they regard as not their friends. The last thing I'll say about that is virtually every use of force in international affairs has been justified in humanitarian terms. And I believe this is indicative of something powerful and nearly universal just beneath the surface of sovereignty. Everyone aspires to be legitimate. That can be a helpful thing. We're going to burrow into other people's business before taking a look at our own. The next few slides will touch on complex and disparate situations that exemplify some of the searching and difficult questions about legitimacy in this fast-moving period of globalization. In the interest of time, I can only say a few things about each area of distress, and you may want to take issue with some or all of these things when we enter the discussion phase of the evening. So we'll start with China's problematic peripheries. Taiwan used to be under martial law. In the 20th century, it was not a democratic state. It was a dictatorship, a brutal dictatorship. Today, it's a vibrant democracy. Taiwan used to have a seat on the United Nations Security Council. It was China in legal terms. In 1971, the United States, followed by many other countries, withdrew its recognition of Taiwan as the legitimate representative of China. Might regard that as inevitable and very pragmatic. But nevertheless, Taiwan is now at risk and it's a great deal of risk. And it's a complex situation where the United States has a duty, a self-professed duty to protect it from attack by China. The United States does not recognize Taiwan as an independent country. Taiwan has yet to recognize itself as an independent country. It's a very important trading partner. It's our sister state. As an aside, Montana has a sister state relationship with Taiwan. In any event, given the events elsewhere on the periphery of China, we should be watching and listening very closely to what China does with respect to Taiwan. You know, it's all over the news right now, the protests in Hong Kong. You know, they were dwindling and now they're back again. These are many, many, many thousands of Chinese people who are resisting the legitimate authority of China proper, because when China took over Hong Kong, it was a British colony until 1997. And there was a formal ceremony where the United Kingdom gave up sovereignty over Hong Kong and afforded it to China. Well, China made promises about how they were going to treat Hong Kong. They came up with slogans like "one country, two systems." They used the same language with respect to Taiwan. Different systems of economic development, private property rights, political processes. Well, they're reneging on, you know, this is an editorial slant on this. China is reneging on those promises. They're telling the Hong Kong Chinese, you can elect your leadership, but we will develop the list of qualified people you can elect. So the Hong Kong Chinese, lots of them are rebelling. At the same time, there's a big question about the legitimacy of the methods by which people protest government. Lots of Hong Kong Chinese who are not enamored with China's oppressive behavior, but they're sick and tired of having their businesses disrupted by people in the street. So that's another aspect of legitimacy worthy of our consideration. What methods of dissent are more legitimate than others in that they don't offend people who are maybe riding the fence, not knowing which way to go? They haven't made a determination about their future. Moving to the far west of China, Xinjiang province is inhabited by millions of non-Chinese people. These are ethnically different. They're Central Asian folks. They are Muslims. They have a sense of not a right to independence, but they have in their history a brief moment of independence called Turkestan. Their language is different. It's a Turkish-based language. They happen to be sitting on strategic territory in geopolitical terms. A lot of natural resources are there. The Chinese want them. The Chinese need room for a burgeoning Han Chinese. That's the major ethnic group. So in Xinjiang province, there's lots of big mines being developed, lots of transportation nodes being developed, and the Chinese are moving themselves en masse into this area. The United States, at the behest of China, regards the minority group, the Uyghurs, that's the name of the group, as terrorists. So in a strange sense, we are in league with China in treating an ethnic minority as terrorists. Now, they have resorted to terrorist tactics against the Chinese. They've never done anything against the United States. But that's a problem. And lastly, we all know something about the Dalai Lama. Tibet is another area of vast resources. The Tibetan people are oppressed. They are burning themselves to death in hopes that somehow China will recognize that the Dalai Lama, who lives in exile in India, needs to be brought back into the country. He's the most dear thing to the Tibetan people. He has no aspirations for an independent Tibet. We can talk further about that. Another situation, Mother Russia. You know, Russia is reverting to a traditional imperialist mode of behavior. The communist aspect of Russia is almost a forgotten element. We know what they're doing. Well, we witness, we hear about what they're doing in Ukraine through stealth warfare, not overt invasion, but the use of covert methods and people without uniforms, arms without labels. They're taking over a part of Ukraine, the most industrialized part of Ukraine. They're making moves, perhaps, we'll hear more details later, on the Baltic republics because of there are ethnic Russian minorities in the Baltic republics, as there are in Ukraine. There is a huge ethnic minority group in Kazakhstan and Central Asia. So the argument that Russians are making is, we're doing this to preserve the rights of our kin and our co-religionists. This goes back centuries when Russian Empire acted similarly to protect Orthodox Christians from the depredations of Catholicism and Islam. I want to read something quickly. I'm going to go a little faster here, but I want you to figure out who's saying this. From the outset, Russia has advocated peaceful dialogue, enabling Syrians to develop a compromise plan for their own future. We are not protecting the Syrian government, but international law. We need to use the United Nations Security Council and believe that preserving law and order in today's complex and turbulent world is one of the few ways from keeping international relations from sliding into chaos. The law is still the law, and we must follow it whether we like it or not. Under current international law, force is permitted only in self-defense or by the decision of the Security Council. Anything else is unacceptable under the United Nations Charter and will constitute an act of aggression. These remarks were published in the New York Times on September 11th, 2013. And I'll leave it to your imagination to figure out. We'll give you the answer if you haven't figured out whose remarks those are. It's a supreme irony in light of what's going on in Ukraine and elsewhere today. Kurdistan. This is a new state that may be born of the bloody crisis involving ISIS, if the Kurds are not betrayed by friends and neighbors, including the United States. They are fiercely determined in a crossfire to achieve their goal, which is statehood. NATO member Turkey will not defend them, and the Prime Minister, or the President now of Turkey, equates them with ISIS as extremists. The Kurds are very plain-spoken. This is the intelligence chief from the Iraq part of Kurdistan. We need our own laws, our own rules, our own country, and we're going to get them. So their sense of legitimacy is deeply rooted, and this mess in the Middle East may be the only way they achieve their long-standing goals. Israel and Palestine, we really can't talk about either one of them without reference to the other. It's a safe home for the Jewish people as distinct from the Jewish state. That's Israel. It's a settled land for Palestinian Arabs who have been forsaken by their Arab brothers time and time again. Israel can have democracy or a Jewish state. It can't have them both, especially in light of demographic trends. Palestinian Arabs who are Israeli citizens, their population numbers are growing much more rapidly than Jewish population. So it's in the cards. If not for 1 million refugees from Russia in the last decade, that demographic turning point would already have been reached. In other words, there would be a majority of non-Jewish people inside Israel. A secure Israel and a viable Palestine are not possible given the current borders. There may be a two-state solution. There may be a one-state solution, and I would broach the topic of considering Belgium in the Levant, in other words, a confederal state, much like Belgium, but in the area that's occupied by Israel and the Palestinians, or no state at all, if Iran or somebody else decides to use nuclear weapons. And in that event, there won't be any Palestinians either. We're almost done. Moving back quickly to the domestic front. This first point is all about the 1% that we've all read about and fretted about, who are aided and abetted by Wall Street buccaneers and the big banks and what's been called the captured state in America. A lot of evidence that we've become, once again, an oligarchy rather than a democratic, capitalist, freedom-loving country. There are increasing efforts to require formal identifications to vote. That's either suppression, willful suppression of voters to favor one party, or, alternatively, an effort to preserve the integrity of elections. The allegation is there's a lot of voter fraud. That's why people need IDs. But there's so little evidence of voter fraud. There's something else at work there. You've all heard about Citizens United, this infamous now Supreme Court decision that has several precedents before it that lead up to the conclusion that you can't regulate political money because it's equated with freedom of speech. And corporations have rights just like people. I wanted to bring a little bit of Montana flavor into this and mention that, you know, there's what some people consider a non-legitimate endeavor to put legislative measures that are going to be vetoed, and everybody knows it, or amended through veto, and put them on the ballot directly and then fight it out in the public view. So there's one of those that will be on the ballot this year about ending same-day voting registration. Lastly, we talked about tribal sovereignty last week, and it's important to note that there are still Indian tribes in America who are seeking to become recognized. That's where they gain their legitimacy as organized tribal nations, is they have to be recognized by the United States government. That's working through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I'll leave it at that. So we are faced with a panoply of unpopular policies arrived at through legal maneuvers and judicial decisions. Does this mean legitimacy is on shaky ground? To me, this is the fundamental conundrum. Just because the processes are legitimate, does that mean we have a legitimate system? Can we have legal corruption? I mean, I think the answer to that is fairly evident. So finally, we're getting to the question that we'll end on. We're, considering the Middle East muddle, and some considerations before you attempt to answer this question. And again, you're not compelled to answer this question as discussants or as an audience, but I'm just throwing it out there as something to get the conversation going about this main subject of legitimacy. So in my mind, I'm thinking about the legitimacy of the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, the legitimacy of the Hashemite Kingdom in Jordan, and other allies of the United States in the Middle East region. We have to think about the legitimacy of elections that have gone awry, with Muslim extremists gaining victories. We have to consider the illegal settlements on the West Bank in Israel. I mean, there's just no doubt about the fact that they are against international law. We have to think about Palestinian attempts recently to obtain recognition as a state at the United Nations. The majority of countries in the General Assembly of the United Nations are saying, yes, we recognize Palestine as a state. The United States, no way, will veto any attempt to have that happen. Just the other day, the British Parliament, a majority of people in the British Parliament voted, with a lot of people abstaining, including the Prime Minister, voted in favor of recognizing Palestine as a country. That's a momentous shift in the attitude of the West, at least a member of the West. I think we have to think about, in trying to answer this question, the public and the presidential reactions to 9/11, not that long ago, and more recently to the barbaric beheadings of journalists in the Middle East. In other words, our responses at the gut level and at the policy level, are they actually legitimate, sound responses to these provocations? And lastly, and in a sense least, what about oil? I mean, does oil even figure into our sense of legitimacy of our own behavior in the Middle East anymore? Or is it still embedded at the bedrock of what we do there and who we make friends with, not counting Israel? So I leave you with the question, and we'll take a few minutes to take a break, and in about 7 minutes we'll come back and we'll invite our discussants up to the table. So thank you. Welcome back, and I want to introduce our discussants again this week. At the far end of the table, Dennis Taylor. Next to him is a newcomer to our midst, Dave Hunter. You all have biographies, but we're kind of cutting to the chase. We're just going to get to the discussion. And Professor Pavlakis, Professor of History at Carroll College. Terry Kendrick from the Office of Public Instruction. And John Driscoll, who was with us last week. Now, I'm not going to stay standing up here. I'm going to sit down and join you. Don't feel like you have to speak to me or look to me to moderate the discussion. You're more than welcome to just enter into a discussion amongst yourselves, and I will join you when I can and if I can. And after a period of time, we'll announce that the audience is free to approach a microphone in the audience and participate that way. So without any further discussion on my part, I think I'll just hand it over to Dennis for the kind of initial response, either to the question, the large question asked at the end of the presentation, or to something that's on your mind that's relevant to the subject of legitimacy.
Actually, this is the subject of legitimacy really grew out of our discussion last week when we were talking about sovereignty. One of the core foundations of legitimacy is a reciprocal relationship. It's that people think that a government is legitimate and is respected, and other people recognize that. And so I'm torn with a good way to start off tonight. Certainly the preemptive war that got us into Iraq seems to me, even with the discussion at the United Nations and in our Congress, sure violated some of the principles of sovereignty, and it tugs at the limits of legitimacy even from our own action, and seems to have spawned a lot of the things that we will be reacting to and talking about tonight with regard to ISIS or ISIL or some of the things that are happening in the Middle East. Although I was thinking back when you were talking about the meeting with Bismarck in 1880s or whatever, I think there was a similar division of what might happen in the Middle East and with Germany and France, where they were planning in, say, 1911 or 1914, somewhere around there, to divide up the Middle East, and along the same lines that you see the activity that is taking place right now, some of the divisions that might create a Kurdistan or this ISIL phenomenon, or the tensions that exist even with Palestine and Israel, as well as the question about what's the difference between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I don't know the answers to these, but I look forward to the discussion as we go forward.
Anybody, anytime. And yeah, that's a great microphone behavior right there.
Okay. Well, I wanted to touch on this whole notion of hypocrisy. We've talked about the hypocrisy of the Russians. I think that's the veiled quote that we had earlier. But in fact, no major country is immune from the charge of hypocrisy, which makes it not a useful organizing tool, because you can sit there and point at each other's flaws all day long without actually solving any problems. Only, it seems, small countries have the privilege of acting consistently. Norway and Sweden come to mind as countries that have set up a set of principles and tend to stick with them through thick and thin in different situations. But particularly in the Middle East, where there's, I think, and you've already alluded to this sense of the people who live there that their destinies are not their own, that they seem to lie in the hands of others. And that is reflected both in cries for help and in seething resentments that build up and have long lives. You know, when the contested Iranian election, not the most recent one, but the previous one, the government, went after the British diplomats. And to people in America, the response was, well, what are you going after Britain for? They don't have anything to do with Iran. Ignoring this long history of British meddling in Iran. Now, maybe they're conjuring it up now as a fiction to divert people, or in fact, maybe it's still going on. Very difficult to tell, because Britain is not Norway. It's not a state that's acted on consistent principles throughout its history. And so this inconsistency creates, I think you could call it a crisis of legitimacy. So is the U.S. involvement in Iraq legitimate? Because, as we've been told, the Iraqi government requested it. And then the question is our humanitarian involvement in Syria legitimate? Such humanitarian involvements in Syria took place before, early in the 1800s. Britain and France went into Syria to protect the people there. And got enmeshed in such a retaliatory, set of atrocities by their allies and by their enemies that the whole enterprise became tarnished with the blood on everybody's hands. And it failed really to succeed at the humanitarian objective that it was undertaken for. Anyway, I wanted to open the door to these questions of, maybe we need to set aside hypocrisy and try to be as realistic as possible about what's best.
I think I agree with your point on hypocrisy. It's not that there's no hypocrites, it's just that it's so universal that it's not very useful as far as nations go. I'd like to take a shot at the big question that was at the end of the presentation. First by saying that I happen to agree with Vladimir Putin. Seems like he and I are on the same shade of music all the time anymore. He's been very direct. He's been very articulate for years now that NATO was expanding too fast, and we didn't pay attention to him. And what he said in the New York Times about the reasons for going to war, which is the ultimate evil. I mean, war is terrible. And we go at it in a drop of a hat, it seems like, anymore. I can't quite... It seems like we've lost our way when it comes to making war. But when he said that it's just for self-defense and in keeping with the Security Council resolutions, I agree with that. Which brings up what's going on in the Middle East right now. And I would like to draw your attention to a great experience I had. I was at the Pentagon before 9/11 for some time, and I was trying to think of what I could do in Washington while I was there, and I thought, well, I want to go see Mike Mansfield. I've never met the guy. So one thing led to another, and I had a chance to sit and visit with Senator Mansfield, Ambassador Mansfield, just before he died. He was 99 years old. We had a great conversation. And he was not taciturn at all. I just sat and listened for the most part, and he was very agitated, and I'm not overstating this. He said, why has NATO become an offensive organization? We've spent all those years making a defensive organization, and now it's become offensive. What's going on? Well, I couldn't answer that, but in 99, we had met, this was 2001, just before 9/11, that we were visiting. He was working for Goldman Sachs, but by then, NATO had already brought in, I think, Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, expanded that far. And there was plans afoot to bring in the Slovakia, Slovenia, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, I think Bulgaria, Romania, and all those have happened since. A couple of years later, that happened, and that flew in the face of the fact that clear back in 1990, when the Berlin Wall came down, when Baker was negotiating for the U.S., the Russians were saying, well, if we let loose of East Germany, are you going to expand NATO or not? And we kept fudging around on it. And finally, Baker had put in his notes that we weren't going to expand past East Germany because that would really upset the Russians. But when Mikhail Gorbachev asked if his country could be a member of NATO, we said no. And then later on, Baker, in his notes, his personal notes, he said, in every great initiative like this, there's somewhere in there is a seed of another problem. Well, the seed of the other problem was already identified by Mike Mansfield back in 2001, and by me. I mean, really obvious. It's obvious. We've been pushing these people into a corner. For us to say that somehow they're doing something devious now is, to my way, really hypocrisy in capital letters. Having said that, and having said what I said about the evils of war, what do we do with ISIS? And I think the answer may be with NATO. NATO is looking for a home, really. And over the years now, it's gradually become a part of the UN, really. The International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan, after 2 years, they were tired of moving different commands in. So to get a stability in the command and control, they moved in a NATO command and control system into Afghanistan, which isn't anywhere near NATO. And then rotated Canadian, Italian, German, Turkish commanders through there, American commanders through there every 6 months. And NATO basically ran the operation in Afghanistan, as now is pulling out after, 14 years. Same thing in Kosovo. I was involved in the Kosovo operations at the Pentagon, and that was a NATO operation. That was, and of course, at that time, you remember when the Russians ran that armor company down to Pristina Airport to try to make us look bad, and did. Well, that was all part of Russia trying to say, don't be expanding NATO's functions, their geography, and so forth. So now NATO, according to Janes, is faced with, what's it going to do next? And one of the things they're looking at inside of NATO is kind of tailoring their collaboration. So if your country's interested in what's going to happen in the Arctic, it's certain groups of countries. Down in the Mediterranean, certain groups of countries, and so forth. I think there might be the answer to that as long as it's associated with the United Nations Security Council. So I hope that if Congress stops being hypocritical and takes a vote on whether or not we should be at war after telling the world that they want to vote on everything else the president does, I hope that they will vote against going to war, but let NATO functionally evolve into some kind of capability that will deal with ISIS.
Let me just speak to the issue of legitimacy a little bit. As I've worked with the National Democratic Institute, it's interesting to see the lengths that countries go to provide themselves some legitimacy to be perceived as elected democratic governments. I think most true in Russia and Ukraine in terms of recent examples. Certainly by our standards, far from legitimate elections, but a lot of effort on their part to be able to portray themselves on a world stage or diplomatically as democratically elected governments. And I think it is a challenge that we ought to think about in the U.S. context as well, that as our participation declines, we're one of the few countries in the world that actually requires its citizens to register at all. I mean, that you don't have a right of vote just by your citizenship. That's not true most places. Certainly the only developed democracy where we hold elections on a work day to make it harder for working people to vote instead of on a Sunday or over a weekend, that we actually have a system that, as compared to most other democracies, makes it difficult for people to participate instead of easy. We consider our democracy legitimate. We have elections. Of course, we're a legitimate government. Yet we put obstacles in the way of our citizens that some other countries don't. Now, I still believe U.S. elections are far more legitimate than certainly Ukraine or Russia's or some others that I've participated in. But the appearance of legitimacy, surprisingly important.
I always hate to say this, but I agree with Dave Hunter. And for me, I was in Mexico. I think it was in the 2002 presidential election. I have the year right, but in any event. And the election was on a Sunday, and people were lined up, and they have almost 100% of their people voting, even though the election in some ways was a foregone conclusion, that the party in power was going to win. But still, people turned out to vote. The issue of legitimacy for me, too, is also who is defining it? Who has the power to define what is legitimate? And then, people sort of fighting against that. I guess, was it legitimate for us to go to war with against Iraq because of the because of 9/11? I think that, is it legitimate just because maybe the majority of the American people want something? That those aren't really the ways that we would want to, I think, define legitimacy. Or the people in Ferguson, the police are supposed to be a legitimate safeguard in your community, and yet they don't act that way. And so the people are going to respond, and they're going to push back to defend their own sovereignty, for lack of a better word.
All of your comments have provoked, lots of questions in my own mind, and I'll try and get one of them out. One of the things I am sort of brooding on is, you mentioned a crisis of legitimacy on a global scale, and I certainly acknowledge it seems that way to me. And hypocrisy is part of that. People don't like to witness hypocrisy in the mirror. The other thing is, I sense a growing sense in the United States. We're kind of, I'm purposefully looking at the world from the United States, but looking back at ourselves, more and more people are losing the capacity even to trust in the government. One of our candidates for office right now, I won't use names, asked a group of people here in Helena not long ago, just starting his campaign. These are the learned fathers and business leaders of our community, men and women alike. They meet every week, and this guy comes in and he says, all right, who in this room believes in the government, trusts in the government? And I'm looking around, and a few hands kind of shakily start to go up. It was stunning to me, and I wasn't going to raise my hand either. It's like, well, with the NSA breathing down everyone's neck, with all these foreign policy debacles in recent memory. I know I'm wandering around, but I guess I'm trying to swirl around to a question for each of you about, do you think that trust in government is fundamentally essential for legitimacy to be experienced? Can we have legitimate government in a democracy when people don't trust in it anymore? Kind of a wide open question.
I'll take a stab at that one. I think that throughout our history, there have been reasons not to trust the government. So this is not a new thing by any stretch of the imagination. And yet I don't think it's that people, if I were president or whatever law I would say is, you don't get to be cynical about the government. You have to still engage and still work to change it. And that's really the only way that things can get better. So it's not enough to just say they're all crooks, because they're not, and they're really different ideologically. And there are people who are really pushing for a certain view of the world and people who are pushing for another view. And the only way that we can have sort of democracy is for people to stay engaged. And that is you raised the question, Steve, about are we an oligarchy or a democracy? And I think that is a question that we need to grapple with at this stage in the country.
Yeah, I just want to say this whole thing about Americans don't trust their government. you go other places, Americans trust their government. I mean, the same people who won't raise their hand want to change textbooks in America to only teach about American exceptionalism. I mean, it's like, really. I mean, the same people who say, we don't trust our government, are the people who believe that we ought to impose our system of government on Iraq and Afghanistan and Egypt and other countries. Well, if we don't believe in it, then why are we doing this? And I would really say, for even the American experience, I mean, our day-to-day experience as American citizens with government is really very positive. I mean, our policemen don't demand bribes when they stop us. We don't have to pay a bribe to get our kids into school. I mean, American government at the level that we experience it every day, as compared to the rest of the world, is really a very trustworthy government that delivers services. And even at the federal level, people say, I don't believe in my government, I don't trust Congress, but I like my congressman. Well, again, I mean, there's a little disconnect here that that we have to recognize. I mean, we believe in our government as a system. We just don't believe in some of the leaders in aggregate. But we all like our own leaders because we don't believe in our government, but we elect 90% of the United States Congress gets reelected every year. Well, again, those facts are a little problematical.
But Dave, I mean, don't you think that throughout our history that really hasn't been the case? Like, say, for blacks in the South, or we haven't been the shining beacon of democracy. We're an evolving democracy, and perhaps right now it's a better time than others, but I think that people could really have said in our history, I do not trust this government, and they had, they had legitimate cause.
No, I agree with that.
At any time, anybody in the audience is welcome to join in the conversation. So, again, there's no pressure to do so, but it's an open invitation. So if you were to make your way to a microphone, we would acknowledge you immediately. In the meantime, Dennis, I think you have a pregnant thought.
Not really, but I would just, I'm with Dave on the idea that we are always critical of our democracy and of our country for its flaws. But when you go to other countries, like I had talked about my involvement with Myanmar, with Burma, and just seeing a country that's been under a military dictatorship since 1962 that is trying slowly to become a more legitimate government, or at least doing things to gain the legitimacy that Dave was talking about. We aren't engaged in people disappearing like you hear about in Belarus. People can exercise their opposition to the government. We've had people in Montana, as long as I've been here, that would be called militia, freemen, posse comitatus, and unless they do something against someone, they're allowed their freedom of speech, they're allowed their advocacy, they're allowed to exist. That's not the case in these other countries. My daughter has been working in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and she's on her way to Tajikistan, and I see first what they experienced while they were part of the Soviet Union, and then their struggles to be a democracy since 1990, and how difficult that has been, where they have sort of a combination of the traditional leadership based on custom and practice and sometimes religion, and then they have their charismatic leaders that grew out of, say, the Soviet system. A lot of people who were leaders in the Communist Party in these countries became the legitimate elected leaders as they became moving towards democracy, and now they're trying to create these institutions that we would call the rational legal part, the constitutional part, the part where there's consent of the governed, which we seem to believe from our perspective in Montana, where people would give consent, and where you have something like a constitutional boundary on arbitrary power, and there's reciprocal rights both for majorities, but also a strong recognition of minority rights within a constitutional framework. So I think we have things in our past that we should be incredibly ashamed of, but we also are willing to make corrections along the way. And I'm on the side that last week we talked about how whether it's the city council or the legislature in Montana every 2 years, it's an experiment in governing ourselves. Democracy is very fragile, and even though we've been doing it for 300 years, we're still learning how to do it better. And if we don't do it better, then we reach deadlock. If we reach deadlock, then we lose legitimacy. And in places like the former Soviet Union, there was, without legitimacy and without arbitrary power, there was total collapse. And that's available to us as well as these other nations when they lose legitimacy in the eyes of the people that they govern.
I took a shot at running for Congress. Maybe someday I'll have a parking garage named after me. But earlier this year, I had a chance to read Thomas Jefferson, one of his biographies, and it was really quite amazing, how the Democratic Republican Party started from a bunch of groups and drafted Jefferson to become president, our second president. And what he and Gallatin, who was the finance guy, and then Madison and Monroe, that were presidents that came after Jefferson, they represented the Democratic Republican Party. They were trying to instill, I guess by habit, representative government, because the Federalists were basically royalists, and they didn't care if it worked or not. They really didn't. And I found myself this year looking at the Tea Party people that are in Washington that shut our government down. It seemed as though they didn't really care whether our representative government worked. And so I saw a similarity in my mind between the Federalists of back in those days and the Tea Party now, in spite of what they call themselves. The actions speak louder than their self-imposed titles. But one of the things, and I have no regrets, I've spent $4,995 and had a chance to say my piece, and so that's fine, I'm happy. But unexpectedly, one of the things I found out after, I'd run for office many times before and also at the local level. I was going around getting lists of precinct committee men and committee women, so I go introduce myself and ask for their support and so forth, and I found out there weren't any to speak of. I found that after going to 56 counties in Montana and trying laboriously to get all their names and talking to all the clerks and recorders, 9 by phone, the rest face-to-face or their staffs, that 86% of the precinct committee man and committee women positions in Montana for the Democratic Party have not been filed on by anyone. There's nobody in there. And 78% of the Republican, so an average of about 82, 84%. And that was really startling to me, because when I came home from the Army, I was put into public office or put on the ballot by our local party, and there was a precinct committee man and committee woman in every county. And it looked to me like, for example, in the Democratic Party, there was only 3 counties that could even marshal a quorum: Ravalli County, Hill County, and Granite County. And in spite of that, I noticed that quite a lot of counties have been able to send delegations to our convention to pick a senatorial candidate. And I, having had to deal with parliamentary procedure as a speaker and a majority leader in the legislature, I can't figure out how they did that with no people in the precinct positions. So I find myself wondering what's really going on in both parties that split, from Democrat from Republican sometime way back when. And I remember that Jefferson used to say, well, this idea of a Democratic-Republican Party is a stopgap thing. He was hoping someday we could go without parties. And so maybe that's what comes next. Parties that really, you don't really need parties. People are voting with their feet. The clerks and recorders told me, they've been studying this, how people who are traditionally Democrats or Republicans in their small towns in Montana really don't like what their party is doing in both the state or the federal level, and they don't want to be associated with it amongst their friends. That's what was startling to me. So maybe it's not bad. Maybe what's going on is some kind of an evolution to what Jefferson was hoping for: no parties. But in the meantime, it seems as though our government is hijacked in many ways into the Middle East by the Saudis and the Israelis. You name it, there's a special interest that's somehow gaining from some of the NATO expansion. I mean, who are the special interests there building AWACS aircraft and so forth? Boeing. So you wonder, okay, if there's going to be no parties that having legitimacy, what's going to take their place? Television? The computers? I don't know. But I find that I strongly, as often as I think of some of the things that Reagan did, I think he did a couple things well. I really don't like him for the fact that he ran against the government. And it's become a lazy habit now that we refer to the government instead of our government. And as far as I'm concerned, it's still our government.
I want to acknowledge a patient member of our audience who wants to weigh in on this. So go ahead. You can identify yourself if you choose to, but you don't have to.
My name's Ed Stevenson. A comment about the distrust of government. Folks want the CDC and the TSA to do something about Ebola, and those are not local issues, obviously. The other one, I'm not quite sure what my question is, but as you've talked about the Middle East in particular, and as I've been reading in recent days, it's clear that what we've been doing is relatively ineffective. And so not only the matter of legitimacy, but how do we develop, I mean, one of the things you've said about being good about the American government is we get stuff done. By and large. You get a decent police force, and the sewers more or less are working and so forth. We clearly have not gotten it done with regard to a lot of the Middle East situation, and I think a lot of that has to do with most of our policymakers being relatively unfamiliar with some of the kinds of history and some of the kind of cultural issues that you have raised. I don't know what question's in there, but the difference between legitimacy as a concept and effectiveness in terms of U.S. self-interest or whatever that might be. I'd like some comments about that.
Let me just address that a little bit. I mean, I think the trouble is, you know, having worked for the National Democratic Institute that works in 60 countries, you know, America's good at war. You know, we're not so good at building democracies after the fact because America's patience and our willingness to spend money on things that are non-military is not very good. You know, let me just give you a little example out of Ukraine. You know, I went to a focus group with pensioners in Kiev. You know, Kiev's full of 20-story gray apartment blocks where pensioners were given the title to their apartments after the fall of the Soviet Union. But the West, I mean America, the European Union, didn't come to Ukraine and help them establish the things that we expect out of government, like condominium associations. So for 20 years, nobody's maintained the elevator, right? So you're a 70-year-old pensioner. You have to walk up 15 flights of stairs with your groceries because the elevator doesn't work. Well, you go to the focus groups and pensioners say, well, it was better in the Soviet times because the elevator worked. Well, you know, I mean, those are the simple things that sometimes it takes that we all take for granted, that we have a system of laws that creates things like condominium associations that make democracy work and make people's lives better. And, you know, it's not just that, you know, you have to go succeed militarily. You have to help people build a system of government that makes their lives better. Because if you don't, you know, chaos will reassert itself. And our patience on the democracy building end, our willingness to commit resources and time and cultural sensitivity is not very good. And if we want to succeed, we really have to do both. I mean, the George W. Bush that, you know, democracy's on the march and, you know, somehow these people all figured out and fixed their problems, you know, it's just not that simple.
Well, we're fast approaching the end of the program, but I want to invite each of you briefly to, if you have a closing statement of any kind, now's the time for it. And at about 8:23 or so, we'll have our quiz. So have at it, Professor.
All right. To start off, I want to touch on a subject of legitimacy we haven't talked about yet, and that is the United Nations Doctrine of Responsibility to Protect, which was first passed by the General Assembly in 2005 and has been evolving ever since. And this is really momentous in human affairs, and we're still really figuring out what it means. But it says that the first responsibility to prevent crimes against humanity lies with respective governments, that if they fail to do so, that the international community has a responsibility to use what measures are necessary to help them end this, and if the government itself is at fault, to intervene with, as the very last resort, military intervention sanctioned by the UN Security Council. And it's funny to watch in international affairs right now the competing claims of humanity that are being used by people on both sides, by Russians, by Americans, etc. But that nobody's in the habit of actually following through the steps outlined in responsibility to protect. And I think that's an interesting note to leave on. You know, what does it make to make that the legitimate process?
Well, I think if everyone's said their piece, that's wonderful. And Professor, I want to thank you for bringing responsibility to protect to the forefront right here and now. It will actually be the major subject of our last meeting. So we want you to come back and talk more about it. Because as you say, one of the things I wanted to end on was sort of a reminder about, you know, here in America, the legitimacy of our system is rooted in belief in the rule of law. And the rule of law functions fairly well, notwithstanding that we have more prisoners per capita than any other country on the face of the earth. Most of us trust in the rule of law, that we're going to get a fair shake from government, from judges. International law is so vastly underrated, in my opinion, in the United States. It's those small, virtuous countries that know international law, you know, chapter and verse. Americans tend to be not knowledgeable about it, and if they are, often disrespectful of the law. It gets trashed in the U.S. Congress routinely. So that's something I would like to address further in future meetings. Having said all that, we're at the closing end of the session, so I want to engage you in a quiz, and I would invite the discussants to go sit in a comfortable chair to see the screen. Oh, no, there's no Jeopardy music. That's a good idea. Okay. Thank you. All right, here we go. And you're going to have some time to mull this over. And I want to give you not some clues, but a little assistance in that the central the most important words in the question are Islamic world, which extends beyond the Middle East. And maybe we'll use our whiteboard to make a list as people come up with answers. Yeah. Everybody ready to take a shot at this? So, shout out each one as they come to you. You know, anybody. Somalia. Tripoli is, you don't get full points for that. Tripoli is a city. Oh, my mistake. We haven't hit, oh, we're going back in time. You don't have a microphone, but that was our first foreign engagement overseas, was the Barbary pirates inhabiting North Africa and preying on shipping. So was it President Jefferson who ordered the U.S. Navy to go after the Barbary pirates in Tripoli, which is now in a country that someone's going to name? Libya. Okay, that's two. So we have Syria, Somalia, and Libya. Bosnia, in the Balkans, the only remainder Muslim country, or Muslim majority country, not counting Albania, which wasn't part of the Ottoman Empire. But anyway, good one. Lebanon. No, we have, according to this official cheat sheet, we haven't attacked, occupied, or bombed Tunisia.
Since the Second World War. I thought we did that as a German occupied.
Right. So we can't count world wars. Kosovo. We're getting there. Afghanistan. Oh yeah, Iraq.
We had troops into the Islamic portion of the Philippines back in 9/11.
That's a bonus because that's not on this list. So the Islamic part of the Philippines. Kuwait. Yemen, yes. Where are we at number-wise? Yeah. Yeah. Two more to go. I know what they are. Okay, think Central Asia, writ large, or South Asia. Because I don't think we have... Where are most of our drone attacks of late? Pakistan. And we got one to go. Big country, friendly, but not always. And we should think in general, these terms like occupation are rather general and overarching in a sense. So we have had a significant occupying force by invitation. Saudi Arabia. Yeah.
We could say that about Turkey also.
Yes, we certainly could. So you're doing better than the globalist. So that's it. Thanks very much for your participation. Next week, we're moving on to the third corner of our triad with subsidiarity, which is kind of a look at federalism in many ways. The whole notion of the best government is the government most closest to the people that it serves and governs. So thanks once again, and we'll see you next Wednesday.